Welcome, and to Paradigm Shift. Hopefully that title is encouraging and not scary. Ultimately, the choice will be yours about how you're going to shift your paradigm. I want to firstly thank Dr. Benov and his wife Lily, who sponsored this course. And we have 3 courses coming up next year, so if anyone has this great urge to want to sponsor it, just let me know and I'll be happy to partner with you. And a big thank you to Mark Smiler, who's videoing this for our website. Okay, so let's begin. What's unique about this course, Paradigm Shift, in comparison to our past courses, is that it's based on the transformational teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay? What you're going to find a little bit different in this course is that most of the sources are going to be from the Rebbe's talks, and we're going to have a few more videos than usual, which I think is a good thing, and many of them are going to be the Rebbe's talks with subtitles. So make sure you can see the screen and catch the subtitles, because they're going to be important to the subject matter. I just want to say this, and hopefully you'll be able to pick this up from everything you're seeing. Obviously, my inspiration and my mentor is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he was a very holy man, without a question, a man of God. However, he was also a man who had his 2 feet anchored firmly on the ground, which means that he related very, very well, extraordinarily well, to people, to events, to humanity, to life. And that combination is a very powerful combination, and I think we'll all be able to appreciate that as we go through the course. Let me begin by telling you a story about Nathan and Leah. Okay, story about Nathan and Leah. Nathan and Leah got married a year ago. Mazel tov. Head over heels in love. They are a perfect match for each other. It's a year later, right? And guess where they are? They're in their therapist's office. Okay? The last 6 months have been horrible, just terrible. Okay? Leah complains that every time she calls Nathan, Nathan doesn't pick up. He's too busy at work. He's got more important things to do. Why are you always calling me? Etc., etc. He doesn't love me, and he doesn't think I'm important. Nathan says, she's always so critical of me. Whatever I do isn't good enough, etc., etc. And both of them are very upset. Okay. So what does the therapist do? Overall, I know we have some therapists in the room. Overall, the therapist has 2 approaches. That's fine. Maybe you'll do therapy on me at the end of the lesson. The therapist has two choices, general approaches that the therapist can take. One is this. Nathan, why don't you pick up the phone when your wife calls you? Isn't she important to you? And then Nathan goes into the whole reason of why he doesn't pick up the phone. Of course I love her, but I am in the middle of the workday and I got to get this done, and right? And then he starts saying, well, maybe you could sometimes pick up the phone. Maybe you can explain this to her, blah, 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 right? He can turn to Leah and say, Leah, why are you so critical of him? Right? And she says, well, I'm not critical of him. And he says, she is critical. Well, maybe you can tone it down, and work with all the little details. And generally, when you do that, so, they go out, they try and work on the details. It works a little bit. It doesn't work a lot. And they come back, and, hopefully you keep on working at it. Another approach is for the therapist to say, okay, I hear both you, and I got it. I want to ask you a question. Can you explain to me what marriage is? And he asks them to explain how they see what marriage is. And then he actually helps them shift their view of what a relationship is to an entirely different and better place. And if he can successfully do that, or if she can sing, whoever the therapist is, then you actually have solved all the problems, even the problems they haven't brought up yet. Because suddenly they are understanding what it means to be in a relationship. That is what we call a paradigm shift. As long as we are in the same place, trying to fix things, as we would say, locally, the individual issues, we are not really solving the issue. However, when we shift our entire perspective to a whole different viewpoint, suddenly everything can change entirely. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, but it's a phenomenal experience to have. And that is really what the Rebbe tried to give to his followers and to those who his followers teach, which is what's going on right here. So, we can do things like, you can print out a card that says, I'm a great teacher, I'm a great teacher, I'm a great teacher, and you can read it and say it 25 times every morning to try and convince yourself that you're whatever it is that you want to be or need to be. Or you can pump yourself up with confidence by going to some type of a seminar where everyone gets up and says, we can do it, we can do it, we can do it. Or all of these other types of methods. You can read all of these articles about the top 10 things to do in order to be happy or to have a good marriage. But truly, the one thing that I think it would serve us best is a paradigm shift. Asking ourselves, do we really understand what it is that we're in, that we're doing? And maybe we can understand this in a completely different way. And when we do, things shift entirely. So that's what we hope to do in this course, is sheer a shift. And of course, looking at things from this new angle is a choice that you'll choose to make if you wish to, but it's to be able to see things from a different point of view. And that can radically change so many things in our lives just from that shift. How are we doing so far? No objections yet? Okay, pretty good. So there was something extraordinary about the Rebbe's perspective in that he was an extremely positive person, extraordinarily positive person. He had this enormous positive perspective on everything that he experienced. And so let's talk about optimism and pessimism as we know it. And then we're going to try and understand where the Rebbe's optimism came from and how he actually taught it. So we can see if we can really comprehend this deep level of optimism. There are two ways of being optimistic. One way of being optimistic is the way some natural optimists are, and that is they just say, oh, it's going to be okay, oh, don't worry about it, everything's going to work out. And that's very nice. There's a little problem sometimes that we find with that, and that is that it doesn't work that way. Right? Little problem. So, and what happens is, if you're not that optimist, you're the one who is observing or living with or friends with this optimist, you sometimes may lose faith because you say, well, you're nice, you have a great theory, but it's in theory land, it's great. So it's very important that optimism be grounded in reality. It can't just be optimism, everything's going to be fantastic. Is this optimism grounded in reality? And that is what we want to get to today. Understanding how we can realistically be unbelievably, extraordinarily optimistic. That's what we want to get to. And so let's start with learning exercise number 1, because we all know, and you'll go to page 7. Okay, I believe it. No, I'm sorry, page 2. You're going to page 2. Okay, you got it? Okay, and what I would like you to do is, I'd like you to, hopefully you have something to write with. If not, you'll use your thinking cap. And what I want you to do here is to choose your most and least likely response to the situation. So for example, your child is not conforming to classroom rules and also instigates others to disrupt the class. Are you most likely to say every child has ups and downs, or are you least likely to say that? Okay, are you most likely to say, I'm not a good parent? Or are you least likely? We're not sharing this, by the way. This is for you. It's simply for you to be able to assess yourself. So I'm not going to ask anyone to share anything. Okay? Go down this whole list and circle most or least. Are you most likely or least likely to say that in all of these scenarios? Hey, don't worry about the numbers on the right. Just worry about the most and the least. And if you have a pen, it would be worth your time to fill this out. Because we have very few opportunities in life to actually assess ourselves. And we can't get anywhere in life unless we actually get to know ourselves a little bit honestly. So this is a phenomenal opportunity just to fill this out. Okay, so let's go back to Nathan and Leah. So Nathan comes home and his wife is miserable, right? So he can either say, oh my gosh, why did I ever get married? Right? Is that optimistic or pessimistic? Okay. He can say, oh my goodness, my wife probably had a really bad day. A little bit more optimistic? Definitely. Okay. What is it that makes someone optimistic and pessimistic? We can argue from today until tomorrow about that. It's probably partially nature. Some people are born with a nature of being more optimistic. Some people are born with a nature of being more pessimistic. It's probably partially nurture. Probably our parents, and it's always fun blaming our parents, right? So it's probably our parents who also influenced us in the way we look at things. And if they were very negative and pessimistic, that probably influenced us. If they were very optimistic, that also shifted us more to the optimistic side. But whatever it is, it is. But one thing that we also know is, and here's a great little cartoon, a pessimist, I'd read it, but it probably wouldn't do me any good. That's the book of Break the Cycle of Negative Thinking. And here she is on her, I guess it's on the couch in her therapist's office. I'd be optimistic, but there's just too much evidence to the contrary. I like to describe this is a Jewish optimist. The Jewish optimist versus a pessimist is the pessimist says, things are so bad I hit rock bottom. And the optimist says, why are you so negative? Be a little bit more positive. It can always get worse. So there are pessimists, there are optimists, but there's a way of changing that. And the way of changing that is through different types of cognitive skills of training our mind to see things differently. When we learn to see things differently, we can actually become more optimistic. And that is truly the entire difference between an optimist and a pessimist. They both look at the exact same thing, but they see it differently. However, there's a concern that we just raised before, and that is, do we want to be overly optimistic? Perhaps we're going to enter into a realm of denial that it seems that some optimists are in. Let's go to learning exercise number 2. Okay? Where on this continuum would you put the realist? Okay, in other words, there's the pessimist, there's the optimist, someone who's realistic. Where would you put them on this continuum? Would you put them on the middle? Would you put them all the way to the right by the optimist? Is the pessimist the realist? Put your mark somewhere, and I'm just going to ask for 3 volunteers to tell me where you put your mark. Anyone? Yeah? Right in the middle, okay?
I put it at 6.
You put it at 6, okay? Shifting to the optimistic side.
I put it right of center.
Right of center, like Razel? Yes?
5.
A 5?
I'm not answering the question with the mark because they're both realistic. The attitude creates the reality.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Yes? 5 and 6, okay? However you define it. We're using your definition for this. I'm asking you, the way you see someone who is realistic, where would you put them? Okay? You know where you would put yours? You don't have to answer, but you know where? At 3. Okay, very good. So we basically have, for the most part, aside from our doctor philosopher here, We have it pretty much somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle, it seems like everyone feels that that's a realistic person. Okay, this is really important because what we want to learn today is, through a paradigm shift, that a person can be anchored in reality and be all the way to the right. I'm not talking about politically, by the way. Just talking about on this chart. Okay, all the way to the right. Okay, and let's see if we can get there. Okay, but in order to get there, believe it or not, we're going to have to do one more exercise. Okay, let's go to learning exercise number 3. And here's what you're going to do. You're going to match up all of the words on the left with a word on the right, and you can match up multiple words on the left with the same word on the right. That's fine. Like you can, you can say your job and your daily schedule are both a jungle. Whatever. But draw the line over there, and this is really important to do. Okay? Very important, because we're going to come back to this. You want to be able to come back to this. And the less you think as you do this, by the way, the more honest the answer is going to be. So if you're thinking too much, then you're not in touch with yourself. Just, job, your synagogue. Thank God they didn't put your rabbi in. How many of you would say that more than 50% of your list on the left matched up with a garden? Raise your hand. Okay? How many of you have 25% matched up with a garden? Okay? Okay. So I think we can deduce from the hands here that all of us have a small percentage of our life that we would describe as a garden. Is that correct? Okay. The political arena, anyone match it up with garden? Okay, I'm just checking. Jungle. Planet Earth. Planet Earth. What does that look like nowadays? A zoo. Okay, wow. I want to ask you about your synagogue. Human beings. A field, a zoo, okay. Okay, good. Okay, we got it. So I think for the most part, we're on the same page here. So we see something very clear over here, and that is that we don't have a very optimistic view of the entire world around us, okay? Encompassing the many aspects starting with ourselves. And maybe there are parts that we did connect with a garden, but for the most part, most of what we see is not a garden, okay? And hearing zoo and jungle and the forest doesn't sound very optimistic at all, right? And that's fine, because we're realists. We're not optimists. We're realists, right? We're not getting lost in some fantasy. And that's true. That is actually true, and that's very healthy. So how does one become realistically optimistic when we are in touch with reality? There's only one way to do this. And this requires first learning, but then also somewhat of a serious choice. And that is, and this is what we plan to do today, and that is for us to reveal a deeper dimension of reality. Because it is true that the reality that we see is the way we're describing it. We're not off base. But it is also true that we are looking at everything from one dimension. And it's also true that there is another dimension, and arguably a more real dimension than what we are seeing, which looks completely differently. And when we look at it from that dimension, things change entirely. Are we good so far? Okay, so we're going to begin with 1972. Okay, 1972, remember that? I don't. So 1972, sorry, nothing personal. 1972, the Rebbe gave a talk. This was on the anniversary of his father-in-law's passing, and also the anniversary of his taking on the leadership of the Chabad movement. And he spoke about what I think and resonated with what we all just described a few minutes ago. Let's read text number 1. Start with you, Joseph. Go ahead. That's on page 5 in your book. Okay. I cannot tell you how many times people ask this question to me, this exact question. And it's a very real and grounded question. People tell me, what's this messianic era? I'm just using this because this is the way people normally ask it. You think that the world is getting worse and worse. Look at the jungle it is out there, right? And so how can you see this world as moving forward? It doesn't seem like it's moving forward at all. And that's a very legitimate question. And that comes from a perspective that I know very, very well, and I think we all know very, very well, right? This is our initial perspective that I think we can relate to easiest and best. And the Rebbe's concern with this perspective at the outset is when we have a mission, and our mission is to change the world to the good. And how are we going to change the world to the good when we see the world the way it is? That's such a demotivator that we're not going to be inspired to change the world to the good. And while we can still trudge along and do our thing, we need to be motivated if we want to really change this world to the good. And see, here's typically what happens. What happens is this. If I were to ask you, what is the word God synonymous with? Maybe theologically, if it's not from your perspective. God equals what? What would I say to that? God equals truth. Good. That's true. God equals, give me another word, because I happen to be looking for another word. Life. Excellent. Spirituality. Holy. And God equals good. Okay? God equals good. Okay? God equals good. Now, if God equals good, right, and the world looks the way it does, what is the next conclusion that people typically draw? The idea that God created the world and then he went on vacation. Actually, there's a philosophical belief that that's what happened. God created the world and then he abandoned it, right? Which is not the Jewish belief. Okay? However, the reason why people come to this conclusion is when you look at the world, at the reality as we see it. That's the conclusion we come to. The Rebbe says, if our job is to change the world for the good, we have to look at the world as the Torah, which is our guiding truth, teaches us the way the world is, and we need to be able to see it at a different dimension than we're seeing it. Because if we see it at this dimension, we truly have some major questions that need to be answered, just as he actually posed this question in his talk. And so therefore, what does he do? He teaches us that reality is not necessarily what meets the eye, as we normally see. You know, you see is what you get. Well, actually, what you see is not exactly what you get, because there are deeper things that we are not yet trained to see. However, when we go through the effort to be able to see what the average eye, naked physical eye, does not see, we begin to see the world in a very different way. And that's fundamentally important. Number one, to be in touch with reality. We think we're in touch with reality, and we are to an extent, but there's a much deeper reality. And to be in touch with that reality, and when we're in touch with that reality and we see a completely different world, we are highly motivated to continue to change the world. The question is, how do we get to that deeper dimension? So we're going to focus on a verse, which was the verse that the Rebbe based his very first discourse in 1951 when he accepted leadership on this verse. I'm not going to ask how many of you remember 1951, but this is the verse that he based his first discourse on. Text number 2. I have come to my garden, my sister, my bride. This is from the book Song of Songs. Song of Songs was written by King Solomon. It's a fantastic, romantic dialogue between a man and a woman, two lovers. That's what it is. But we know King Solomon, and I hope we know that King Solomon was not a romantic novelist, a romance novelist. What he actually was writing a very holy book. The Talmud says this is the holiest of all of our books because it's actually a metaphor. It's an entire fascinating metaphor between two lovers, which are God and the Jewish people. God being the man, woman, the Jewish people being the woman. And God, who is speaking here, the man is speaking here, says, I have come to my garden, my sister, my bride. He tells us, the Jewish people, I have come to my garden. God's garden is this world that he created. And God said, I have come here. What does that mean that God has come here? What that means is that God says, I am present in this world. What does present mean? And this is very important to our entire discussion, by the way, this example I'm going to use. You know, a couple goes to coffee. Yeah, it goes to have some coffee together, okay? Like once every 5 years. So they go out for coffee, and they're sitting there, and this is what possibly can happen in theory, right? So she says to him, and it usually works this way too. So she says to him, you know, they're sitting, and they're talking, and after a few minutes she says, are you here? And of course he says, of course I'm here. What do you mean am I here? What type of question is that? She says, no, are you here? Are you with me? He says, of course, I'm sitting across from you. Of course I'm with you. And she says, no, I know you're sitting across from me, but where are you? It's like I'm talking to you and you're not even here. And he's like, what do you mean I'm not here? What's wrong with you? Do you think I'm not here? Of course I'm here. What do you think I'm listening to, right? Of course, in complete denial of the fact that he really isn't there. But so what we see is two dimensions. There's the guy is there, but he's not there. And God is saying in this verse, I have come to my garden, my sister, my bride. I'm here. That's what God's saying. God's saying he's truly present in the entire universe. This simple idea is a very important idea. And of course, it negates what we said before about the theory that God abandoned the world. God forbid, God is actually completely engaged in every single aspect of the world. This is something that's really important. It raises other questions. It does. And that's fine. We can deal with those questions. We may not deal with them in this class. But this is the reality that the Torah teaches us. And we'll see this a little bit more as well. Let's go to text number 3. And I want to just add one thing before we read text number 3. And that is that if God is this is very important. If God is engaged in the entire universe, what is engaged in the entire universe? God equals good. That means there is goodness in everything. Everything has goodness. Now, that's like, well, how can you even say such a thing? That's a good question. And we're not going to answer that yet. We'll get to that very soon. Yes? That is from the book Song of Songs. It's if you look behind the Chumash, not in Tehillim. It's another book similar to Tehillim called Song of Songs. If you look in the back of the Chumash that we have, you'll find it, and you can look it up there. Okay? Let's read text number 3. Go ahead. So what the Rebbe is trying to bring out here is that if this is God's garden, you know, imagine if you brought the most skilled gardener into your garden. It's a springtime, right? You bring and they put together a beautiful garden. Okay, right? But imagine if someone had the infinite skills, which whatever that means, it's like, you know, infinite. It's unbelievable. Infinite skills to make a beautiful garden. It would be magnificently beautiful beyond our imagination. And that's actually what this verse is saying, that this world has such good in it. It has infinite good in it. It's such a good place, right? Which of course clashes with everything we see. And that's granted. But we're just opening ourselves up here to at least statements that the Torah teaches us. And we're going to get further in a minute. What is this based on? So we're going to get a little bit philosophical, and then we're going to bring this all into real life. Okay? This is based on a very simple, not so simple, Jewish philosophical idea. And that is, and I'm going to try and explain it a little bit more than our lesson does. And that is that when God created the world, there was nothing before God created the world. Right? Which means that the world coming into existence is constantly dependent on the creator who created it. It has a dependency, just like your microwave cannot work if it's not plugged in, because it's dependent on being connected to its source of energy. The world cannot continue to exist because it didn't exist. Its whole source of existence was a source of energy, which is God. And if that connection disconnects, the world simply ceases to exist. That teaches us that God is continuously engaged in every aspect of the world, because if he wouldn't be, it wouldn't be. Did you follow that? Okay? Even if you're struggling with it, but you're following my thought process. Yes? Okay. Let's read text number 4. This is something we say on our morning prayers every single day. So we see a few things here. In his goodness, God is infusing goodness constantly in the world. God renews each day continuously. At every moment, God is infusing his energy and goodness. And then we quote a verse from Psalms which says, to him, to God who makes. It doesn't say who made great luminaries, who makes. Because God is constantly, at every moment, creating everything that exists. This is the idea that this is all behind, that's behind all this. However, of course, we all have a major problem with this. And what's our problem? This is a great theory, Rabbi, great philosophy, we love it. However, there's just one problem. That's not the way we see life. The fact of the matter is we don't see goodness at all. So let's go to learning exercise number 4 for just a minute. And if you can grab 3 things quickly, and it shouldn't take you that long, list phenomena that challenge the notion that this world is God's garden. Right? You can write Washington, D.C., whatever you want to write. Okay? Okay? Anyone have anything? Anyone write something down? What do you have? The Holocaust. Good.
Man's inhumanity to man.
Man's inhumanity to man. Excellent.
Natural disaster.
Natural disaster. War. Sickness. Fantastic. I think we covered everything. No, really, in categories. Because I want to break this down to 3 categories, okay? One category is human suffering, which was mentioned in the Holocaust, sickness, right? Human suffering, okay? That clearly is not an indication that this world is a good place and that God's goodness is flowing into creation at every moment. Hardships of life, not illness, but just simply hardships of life. You know, the flat tire, the headache, the cancellation, the this, the that. There are so many hardships in life. And lastly, immorality and sin. Simply seeing people not being good people. People doing bad things. Okay? These are, I would say, 3 main and major categories where we see that the world is not a good place. And that challenges this nice philosophy that we just spoke about. So let's watch this video. Okay? We're in this video, the Rebbe is going to use an analogy, which is a Kabbalistic analogy, of a fruit. Okay? Fruit in a garden. Okay? It's God's garden. We all know that many fruit have peels. Maybe almost every fruit has a peel on it. Probably every fruit does, right? Some of them very thin, some of them thicker. Many of the peels are not edible or are not normally eaten. And you need to rip off the peel in order to get to the fruit. And the Rebbe says this is what we need to do. It is true that all of the things we see here, we identify with these things very well. They are so real. They are so much a part of our physical human experience. They're undeniable. And at the same time, beneath this, there is fruit. There is a light and there is goodness. And we're going to get to being able to see that. Okay? But here's the message. So pay close attention to these subtitles here.
Und unter demut, a viel als versteht nicht, weiß ich aber, a Teres Emes hat ma sehr gesagt. Is do sicher, a der Emes is a sei, is unter demut guckt auf der Welt anders. Und als guckt anders, der Setter, und das, was bei einem Bosser beschiedscht ist, auf den nächsten Guck bemerkt man nicht. Weiß aber, was darf suchen. Und sucht in der Richtung auf Eise gefunden, wo sie gefunden sich unter der Klippe, unter der eiswenigste Schollert. Der Peris von unter dem Garn ist abschaß, sucht in der Richtung, ist zum allermeisten ist sicher. Als wird sicher gefunden, warum Teres Hemme sagt immer, dass da und wissen die, als wird sicher gefunden an Nezer Jokor Mikol Jikor. Peris, wo sie sein, wo der Eberste ist auf sie meid. A das Peris von sein Pardis, in welchen gefindet sich in Aiker Schine betachten im Häuser, is lefi Erech von dem Jäger Haperis wird nicht abschrecken und nicht abstellen, keine Stadlos und kein Jegia, und wird sich nicht losen, ob sie abreden und vernehmen sich mit seitigen Sachen, wissen die, als Fem wart an Netzer Jokor Mikol Jikor, Megale sein in der Welt, dass sie gerne Shela Kodesh Baruch Hu. Und Shela Kodesh Baruch Hu in der Neifen von Ike Schchina. Was das ist, lefi Hasboro zu, der Hero von jem Ha-Hilule und jem Ha-Istalkos, auf mitzunehmen das Alkohol ha-Shon im Kula, und mit jem sehr Alkohol ha-Shon bis von Assyri beschwart, ha-Bo Leino Alkohol Israel Letevo, am soll wissen sein, am gefindt sich in einer teure Welt, nur der Jeser Hore sich mischtadel becholi Fanim, auf zudecken die Teierkeit, was gefindt sich in Welt, gedei, mir soll sich mit Jahe sein, Chas v'Sholem. Oder Alkoholponim ton mehr nicht von Jetze wegen V'chuli, und unter demol der Monten sich Ados ist Nosse, auf Drufe selber schaffen geworden, auf zudecken, auf Nemes, ist sich kein Wunder nicht, was gefindt. Kam Pituin v'Hasosis V'chuli, und mir geht lebeter darke derech malke Shalelom ze HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Was hat das Megale gewähren alle die Avodov man malke Rabbonon. Und bechol der, wo der alle die Nosse Shalei und bederein dem Nosse dem Baal Ha-Hilule, und mir geht in der Neifen von Lobeter wissendig an mir sichere Sache mit zukommen. Und gefinnen de Peres Tevis von dem Gan, von dem Gnuni.
The point that the Rebbe was making was that behind every peel is a fruit. And so sure, we can identify very easily with suffering. Can we learn to identify with the fruit? Sure, we can identify with hardships in life. Can we identify with the fruit that's underneath it, that's deeper, that's embedded there? And let's see if we can learn to do that a little bit. Yes?
Why is there a fruit?
What's that?
Why do we have a fruit?
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for that question. That's exactly what the Hasidim, the Rebbe's followers, asked him right after this Farbrengen, after that talk. That's what they asked him. The question was, well, if there is fruit behind every peel, right, why the peel? Great question. Why don't you just make it look like a garden? And additionally, what they asked is, if everything really has goodness in it, how would you explain, they asked the Rebbe, the evil inclination? Now, in case you don't know what the evil inclination is, let me help you orient yourself with your very healthy and thriving evil inclination. Okay? Do you have any, you don't have to answer this, I know the answer. Do you have any toxic behaviors? Do you maybe sometimes do things that you know are not good for you? Maybe you eat things you shouldn't, you drink things you shouldn't, you say things you shouldn't, you get a little bit angrier than you should, you're very jealous, you do things which are immoral, illegal, bram. They can go on and on, right? You got the point, right? Of course, we all have that. We all have negativity. That negativity actually is ingrained within us. We don't have to act on it, but it's ingrained within us because we have an element, we have a force within us called the evil inclination, which is an inclination. It inclines us to do negative things. And we have to fight against that. And so they asked the Rebbe, well, Rebbe, you're saying everything has fruit. What's the fruit of the evil inclination? And you know what the Rebbe answered? He said, you guys forgot about a midrash. And they said, oh, which midrash did we forget? That wasn't exactly how the conversation went. But so the Rebbe pointed them to a midrash, text number 6. Let's read text 6 on page 11. Wow. What it's saying is this, you know, at the end of the 6th day of creation, the Torah says, V'hine tov ma'od, that God saw and it was very good. So the Midrash says, what is it referring to? Tov Mod, it was very good. So the Midrash says, Tov, it was good, was the good inclination God gave man. Tov Mod, very good, was the evil inclination God gave man. You know what that's like saying? That's like opening up the health journal, okay, and reading an article that says kale is good, Coke is very good, right? So that doesn't make any sense, right? So what is it trying to say? It's actually now giving us a deeper perspective, and it's telling us this. Firstly, at the very outset, do you think there would be a population of 7 billion human beings in the world if we didn't have something that inclines us to be selfish and to satisfy our pleasures, etc., etc.? You following me? You with me? Okay. But that's a silver lining outcome of the fact that we have a selfish inclination. But the selfish inclination in and of itself actually is an enormous opportunity. It offers us tremendous opportunity, because without the challenge, the adversity, nothing profound is brought out. For example, if I didn't have to teach this class, I wouldn't understand this subject as well as I do. It's because I have this challenge of presenting this to people that my mind begins to function in a much deeper way than it ordinarily does. Okay? That's not evil inclination stuff, but it's an idea of what a challenge is. The evil inclination can potentially bring out the greatest depths within us. Let's read text number 7, and I'm going to explain this a little bit more. I want you to pay very close attention to this. This is really what we are all about, okay? The purpose of this world's creation, the reason why God created it, a renowned rabbinic statement asserts, is God's desire to have a home in the lowest world. I want you to focus on the word lowest, okay? The greatest achievement that we achieve is when we bring the awareness of God to the lowest possible places, okay? Which is lower, the good inclination or the evil inclination? Which is lower? The evil inclination. Our job overall is exactly what this entire class is about, and that is becoming less conscious of ourselves and more conscious of the dimension of God, the reality of God. Okay? And the lowest of places that we can bring that consciousness of God, the more we are actually doing exactly what God wants us to do in this world, and that is, as we said, God's desire to have a home, to make God at home in the lowest of places. Okay, this is a little philosophical, but very fundamental. Our evil inclination is an enormous opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for us to be challenged by a force that is within us, by desires or impulses that are within us, to take us to places which are very ungodly, and for us to engage that evil inclination and, 1, control it, and then number 2, actually harness the energy that the evil inclination has and use it for positive things. I don't know about your evil inclination, but when I have certain desires to do certain things, those desires are powerful, they're passionate, and sometimes it seems like it's impossible for me to control them. Can anyone relate to that? A few of you? Okay, so it's just the 2 of us. Oh, we're getting a few more hands. Okay. Okay. That's very powerful energy. It's like asking whether atomic energy or nuclear energy is a good thing or a bad thing. It can be a horrible thing. However, it can be an unbelievable thing. It simply depends how we harness that energy. And so the evil inclination on its own is going to take us toward evil. However, as a human being, we were put into this place of challenge so that God wants us, on our own initiative, to transform that and harness that energy and use it for something positive as opposed to it remaining negative. That is making the evil inclination suddenly a home for God, conscious, aware of the reality of God. So, many, many things that go on in our lives are challenges, are challenges, and we'll discuss this a little more. However, there are tremendous opportunities when we begin to look at things from the perspective of God's creating them and why God created them. And that is to use that challenge to reveal God in an even lower place in the world. So I'm just going to reword a little bit of what you're saying. I agree with you. You're right. You're right. However, it doesn't fall apart. It just makes it exceedingly difficult for us to see the good when we are personally suffering. And therefore, I would, as we'll see, the best thing to do when we're dealing with personal suffering is not to try and see the good in it, but to be aware of other good that's going on within our lives or around us. Because sometimes, although someone has to be superhuman, and very, very few people that I know, if any, are able to see the good in the suffering itself, but you can still maintain a very optimistic perspective by staying aware of all of the other good that we have in our lives. We're going to discuss that very shortly. Okay? There are two things that happen in life. There are things that happen to us and there are things that we do. Okay? So very often God does things to us which we have to respond to. And our response to that, we do our best to see it from a deeper perspective, and we see it more optimistically. Right? However, when God's doing something to us which is ending the game, so to speak, the game's over. It's not a challenge that we can respond to because we're no longer living. Do you understand what I'm saying? So true, that's not something that we can respond to. We can look at it a certain way, as Joyce is saying, which is very, very true, and that's also part of our challenge, the way we look at things. In a moment, we're going to let me paraphrase this because, of course, we never have enough time for the whole class. But here's another example, and I'm going to come back to this. Okay, I'm coming back to this in a minute. We're going to get to the suffering. We're all jumping to suffering. We're going to get there in a minute. Jacob, our forefather. Okay, the Midrash tells us that when he was at his uncle Laban's house for 20 years, what's Jacob's story? Jacob has a brother, a twin brother, that wants to murder him. Okay, and so he has to run away from his family. He runs to his uncle Laban, who's a crook. And Uncle Laban also lives in a city called Haran, which is a very crooked place, a corrupt city. So he's in a corrupt city, he's working for a corrupt uncle, he spends 20 years there, and he works very hard, where he says he never gets a decent night's sleep because he's working so hard in the heat of the summer, in the cold of the winter. That's his 20 years. And the Midrash tells us that throughout the 20 years, he would sing psalms to God. How was he singing to God when he was suffering like this? And the way he was singing to God is because Jacob saw that when I came to my uncle Laban, I found my wives and married them. I gave birth to the 12 tribes. My morality has strengthened because I had to live in this environment and remain a moral person. I have been able to bring holiness, because he lived a holy life, in a very, very low place. Our entire purpose, in the lowest of places. And so while it was painful for him in many respects, he saw it from a different perspective. He saw it from a perspective of, what opportunities do I have here? And they're enormous. Look what good I have gotten from here. My wives and children, and look what I've been able to achieve here, which I would never have been able to achieve in another place. Would I have chosen this? Never. Jacob would never have chosen that. However, it wasn't his choice. God gave it to him, and when God gave it to him, he chose, and this is the key, how to look at it. And his choice was to look at it deeper, which gave him the ability to look at it optimistically, as opposed to looking at it in the reality we know it as, where he would have been depressed and miserable. Following? Okay, let's go to, because everyone's really, I got to tell you this also. If you don't know this story, this is just a great story to remember. A joke, I don't know. There was a shoe company, and they wanted to expand their, what do they want to expand? Their market, thank you. They wanted to expand their market. So they sent 2 salesmen to some place in Africa. Okay? And they said, sell shoes there. Right? There's probably very little competition there. They both come there. And they both send back a telegram to the company. I guess it was in those days. Or an email to the company. One salesman says, I'm shipping back all of the shoes. There's no business to be done here. They don't wear shoes here. They walk around barefoot. The other salesman says, send as many shoes as you can possibly send. Open market. No one has shoes yet. And I mean, we can really see this, how two people will respond completely differently to the same reality because they're looking at it very differently. They're just looking at it very differently. And that is the opportunity we have when we begin to see that there is a reality of God, which is a deeper dimension of goodness that doesn't meet the eye, our naked physical eye, but can meet the eyes of our head, so to speak, of our perception. And when we become aware of that, we can choose to persistently find the fruit behind the peel. Or we can stay with the peel. I mean, if that suits you, fine. And you can go, if you go to page 15, you can do a great exercise, which is an example of a recent instance when I encountered adversity and possible ways the adversity might be getting you an advantage. What is it over here that God is giving me? And what good can I possibly come out of this? Just like Jacob found so much good in his situation, what good possibly can come out of it? It's just training us to look out for the good. We have to train ourselves to do this. Okay, we're going to move on to when bad happens to good people, which is what everyone is really consumed with naturally. Okay, firstly, there's text 9a, 9b, 9c, and 9d, which I'll encourage you to read on your own, where Maimonides shows how the world, and we're going to actually, let's read 9d. We will read 9d. Let's read 9d. Okay, that's on page 19. When we talk about suffering, okay, suffering is overwhelming. Suffering is absolutely overwhelming. And therefore, as I said before, it's very hard, most often, it's very hard for us to see the fruit behind the suffering. It's very hard to do. And so therefore, when someone is suffering, the best thing to do is this. Number one is to pay attention to things like Maimonides just explained. That when we look at the world a little bit more carefully at large, we begin to see there's a lot more goodness than we may necessarily pay attention to. The way God structured the whole world is an act of tremendous goodness. Like the resources that we need most are most readily available. The resources we need least are the ones which are least available. And that is all coming out of God's goodness. The second step in this is also to remember that not only is the general goodness in the world existent, but in our own lives there is so much good that we often overlook when we're going through a negative experience or we're suffering. And it's extremely helpful for a person when they're suffering to stop and say, 1 second, I don't want to focus on my suffering. Let me focus on all of the good that I have in my life. And let me show you an example in text number 10 of a letter that the Rebbe sent someone in this regard. Let's read text 10. The Rebbe's point is this, and I want to try and bring everything together here. Very importantly. Number one, as Maimonides explains, the world at large, when we read the headlines, unfortunately, this is the sensation of our journalists, all we see is a negative world. The reality is, the world is filled with far more good in general. And we're not talking about any depth here, and any God. Just the world in general is filled with more good than it is negativity. That's number one. Number two is, even in someone who's in a sufferer's life, there is still a tremendous amount of good. The issue simply is that someone who's suffering has a very hard time focusing on that. But we have a choice, and this is the most important point in this letter, is that human beings must choose which aspects they will emphasize, contemplate, and pursue. And most importantly is this, that this optimism is not a false delusional optimism. Because when we understand this spiritual, godly dimension, that God is in every aspect of existence, and God's goodness is in every aspect of existence, it's not some delusion that I'm trying to convince myself of, that my life is good, it's not bad, or whatever it is, but that truly there is good here. There's good that I can see, and there's even good that I may not be able to see right now. And the more a person simply focuses their mind on that, the healthier they are. And of course, medically, there are so many studies that show how when we look at the good of things, when we're optimistic, how much healthier we are. How people who are ill recover so much more quickly when they pray, which is a sign of a belief in goodness, etc. So this is fundamental to being a human being, and truly as a Jew it's fundamental, because this is what it means to truly believe in God. It means I am aware of the presence of God in everything, and I am going to choose to focus on that. And this was something that the Rebbe believed wasn't something that would be nice for us to, it's not just a nice perspective. The Rebbe believed that we must have this perspective. It's an absolute must for a human being, and especially a Jew who has a mission to make the world a better place, that we must choose to see the godliness, the goodness that is in the universe, and have an optimistic perspective. Otherwise, we don't live happy lives, and if we don't live happy lives, we are not motivated to fulfill our purpose in this world, which is to change the world to make it a better place. One of the ways that the Rebbe expressed this, to so many people in so many scenarios, where he brought out the godliness and the goodness. One example, and some of you saw this video, I believe, in another course that we taught, was when injured soldiers from Israel, Israeli soldiers, were brought to have a meeting with the Rebbe. So we're going to watch a brief video about this. And the point in this video is, I want to bring out this point also. The point in this video is that injured soldiers are called injured soldiers. And the Rebbe insisted that they not be called injured soldiers, but that they be called the extraordinary soldiers, like the exemplary soldiers. And the reason why he believed they should be called this is not to be politically correct, and it was not to encourage them, although I'm sure that was a part of it. But that was not what motivated his choice of words. What motivated, as he will explain in the talk, was because this was the reality. The reality is that people who are injured have an extra energy in them that others don't have, and this has been proven medically as well. He said this about special needs children. The Rebbe wanted special needs children to be called special children, not special needs children, because indeed he firmly believed that special children, they have a connection to God which is unique and more powerful than the average person does. I want to go back to a point which one other point that the Rebbe emphasized when he communicated with people about their suffering. And that is that the Rebbe would always emphasize, this is a very important point that I think is worth sharing here, is that the Rebbe would always say, it would not surprise me that a 5-year-old child cannot understand the conduct of a great scientist. The Rebbe would tell people who are suffering, he wrote this in letters, that you want to understand why you're suffering. We want to understand why the Holocaust happened. Would we agree that a 5-year-old child could not understand the conduct of a great scientist? Would we agree with that? Yes. Now, it is possible that this 5-year-old child may one day grow up to be a greater scientist than the scientist he's trying to understand. Right? That's possible. And we know that the scientist was once a 5-year-old. So the relationship between the two is not that distant. However, we know that the 5-year-old will never understand what the scientist understands. Right? Now, compare that to a human being and God, where a human is completely, infinitely distant from God, because God is infinite. Certainly we should not be surprised that a human being does not understand God and His kindness. It's impossible for us to. The only thing we can do is know that God in His infinite wisdom has something going on over here which I cannot comprehend. And so my only choice now is to see the good that I can see and that I can understand. And those are the other blessings that I have in my life. And this is a choice. It's a conscious choice. We can still wallow in our self-pity. And I'm not judging anyone for doing that. I've done that plenty of times myself. However, we have a choice to make, and that is to see the good.
Mr. Yosef Lautenberg was injured in the Battle for Jerusalem during the War of Independence in 1948. He was among the founders of the IDF Disabled Veterans Organization and the founder of Beit HaLochem, a rehabilitation facility for wounded soldiers. He led the Israeli delegation, made up in large part by injured IDF veterans, to the 1976 Paralympics in Toronto. Mr. Lautenberg had an idea to bring the group to New York to visit with the Rebbe.
התקשרתי למזכירו של הרבי ומיד התקבלתי בתשובה חיובית בחמימות וקבענו את המועד שנבקר בחצר הרבי ובאנו עם שני אוטובוסים לחצר הרבי, לבית של הרבי, וכמובן יצאו לקראתנו והביאו אותנו, שמרו לנו מקומות בחזית הבמה, וישבנו, ואני מוכרח לומר, אני אישית בהתרגשות רבה, וזו הייתה איזו רוח מיוחדת, רוח של קדושה, ויצא הרבי ועלה על הבמה ודיבר אלינו. הוא דיבר, עיקר דבריו היו למשלחת הזו. ואנחנו חשנו בהתרגשות הגדולה שלו, מתוך באמת יחס מיוחד, הוא דיבר אלינו בעברית. זה היה באמת דבר שדיבר ללב כולם פה בהתרגשות. והיו בינינו אנשים מסורתיים, והיו כאלה שאינם מסורתיים, אבל קיבלו את הדבר הזה, את המפגש הזה עם הרבי, באמת בהערכה בהתרגשות רבה, אין פה מה לדבר.
ולכן גם כן אין די כנכה מהשם שנסים למישהו שהוא נכה, שזהו מראה על משהו נחיסוס וירידו, כי אם אדרבה צורך להדגיש בזה שהוא משהו מיוחד ומצוין על ידי ברי האדם שנוסן לכיחס מיוחדים יסרים על מה שישנם לאדם מן השורה, ולכן דווקא ביכולתי להסגבר על קושיים ומניעס שאין ביכולת להסגבר עליהם לאדם מן השורה. ולכן הייתי מציע שישנו השם ויקורו מצוינים בישראל.
ישבנו קסומים שמה, האזנו לדרשה שלו. ואני כאדם שעסקתי כל חיי בתחום הזה, אני יכול לומר שדברי הרבי היו נר לרגליי, ומצאתי אנשים שנפגעו בצורה הכי קשה, עיוורים ומשותקים וכן הלאה, ובמעט שנשאר להם, הם הגיעו להישגים הכי גדולים שאדם יכול לתאר לעצמו, שזה דבר שאדם שלא מכיר את התחום הזה וכן הלאה לא יכול להאמין. וזה הרבי תפס מיד כשהוא ראה אותנו וכשהוא קיבל אותנו, וזה דיבר אלינו בצורה בלתי רגילה. וכשהוא סיים את הדרשה, הרבי ירד אלינו, דבר שאמרו לי שזה דבר שהוא לא מקובל. הוא ירד אלינו, לחץ את ידי כולם, ידי כל המשלחת, הוא לחץ את ידי. זה היה מין חיזיון שקשה לתאר אותו. היינו שם לפחות שעה, שיותר אולי. חשנו שהאיש באמת אוהב אותנו. אוהב את הנתן ומעריך את הנכים שתרמו מגופם לשלמותה ולהקמתה של מדינת ישראל, ואתה חשת בזה, אין פה מה לדבר.
בברכו בתדו רבה על הכובד הגודל שנסקבדתי על ידי הביקור שלכם, והיא רוצן שרבי פעמים תצליחו להוביל שמחו ועיר ויהדות בכל מוקים שתבקרו, הם בחוץ לארץ ולאחרי זה גם כן בארץ הקודש.
Let me tell you about another story to bring out this point, and that is that there was a doctor who had made a celebration in his home for the completion of the writing of a Sefer Torah. And there was a woman there who attended, amongst the many people who attended, who was a good friend of his. And during the celebration, she had an aneurysm and she died. Okay, terrible devastation. He was haunted by what happened because it was his friend, it was at this event, and he felt like there was a problem with the event. How can such a terrible thing happen at such a good, when something so good is taking place? And he wrote a letter to the Rebbe, writing that I'm haunted by what happened, and I can't understand how God would do something so terrible when such a good thing is going on. And I feel like maybe there was something, there's something wrong here. And so what was the Rebbe's response to her? Firstly, the Rebbe emphasized, as he very often did, that we cannot understand the infinite. And that's something we as humans have to learn to realize. Our human mind cannot grasp something which is infinite. Number one. Number two is, every human life is preordained as to its length. So she was destined to die that day. He wanted her to know that. He wanted him to know that. And then he wrote what we have in text number 11. Let's read text 11. And I want you to pay attention as you're reading this. This is simply a genuine, realistic perspective of what happened, which is drastically different than the way we would typically perceive it, the way we just see it. And we can train ourselves to actually begin to see things in this way, which is much healthier and much more grounded in the reality of God. Text 11. So we see very clearly how the Rebbe shows that this actually was a gift from God. And in a certain respect, his celebration of the Sefer Torah gave her a very comforting place to leave this world from. And it's simply how we look at reality. Do we look at it the way we are very accustomed to looking at it? Or do we begin to adopt a divine, a godly perspective in the way we look at everything? I want to bring up one more subject, and then we're going to finalize. And that is what some of you may remember, which was the big hippie movement in the late 60s, right? And following into the 70s. Okay. So how do you think a man like the Rebbe, who is part of a religious doctrine and the leader of a religious group, and not only a religious group, but a Hasidic group, how would he respond to the hippie movement? Horrible, terrible, rebels, they're corrupting the world, etc. That would be typically what we would think. And actually, here's what how the Rebbe responded. And I'm just going to read a part of this in text 12a. This is what the Rebbe said about it. When parents and teachers taught the younger generation proper behavior, they explained it as a means to be able to afford a nice home. You know why you should go to school, you know why you should learn, you know why you should be good, because then you'll afford a nice home, you'll have a large bank account, own 2 Cadillacs, his and hers, and to be honorees seated at the head of a table at banquets. When this constitutes the reason for choosing between good and evil, it's understandable why the youth will ultimately lose all patience for such falsehood. The youngsters are in the process of a spiritual journey. We cannot allow them to drift and get lost. We must educate them according to their needs in a pleasant and kind manner and lead them to a proper understanding of right and wrong. The Rebbe saw the entire movement as a rebellion against corruption in the way good and evil was being taught. That's exactly the way he saw it. He didn't see it as a bad thing. He saw it as actually a very good thing, decrying the moral bankruptcy of modern culture. Additionally, at a different time when he spoke about it, he said in 12b, the youth are brazen, have chutzpah, and are not deterred by anything, not by world opinion, not by their parents or families, not even by the opinions they themselves entertained the day earlier. Instead, they proudly proclaim their absolute freedom to do as they wish. Specifically because of their chutzpah, it is easier to draw them to the true path of Torah and mitzvahs. His basic point was this. Chutzpah is a very powerful thing. It's like our evil inclination. If you take someone who has defiance and determination and they'll fight till the end, they won't listen to anyone, and you harness that and you bring them onto a path of goodness, you have a guy who's going to do good till the end. Nothing will stop that person. And that's the point that he saw in it. Their chutzpah will allow them to discover their Judaism, number one. They're not scared to do something that's out of the box. And number two, rebellious energy channeled properly will change the world. These are people who change the world. These guys are fantastic. We got to get in touch with them. That's exactly how we saw it, the exact opposite of the way we would think a religious person, and I would guess that there was hardly another religious person in the world that was as open to the hippie movement as the Rebbe was. But it's the idea of knowing truly that there is God and goodness in everything. We have to find that God and goodness in it, and we have to harness it and reveal it and make the world a God-conscious place. And so to conclude, I want to, some of you may be familiar with the former chief rabbi of Britain, Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. It's actually a Lord. And he's a person worth following. You can see a lot of his videos on the internet. He's truly a very, very extraordinary individual. And he came to visit the Rebbe before he was a rabbi. And the Rebbe, the first time he came to the Rebbe asked him about what he's studying, and he was studying in Cambridge. And then the Rebbe asked him, in addition to his studies, what is Jewish life like in Cambridge? And what are you doing for Jewish life, I think was the question. And his answer was, in the great, as he himself, I heard this from him, say, in the great British way of avoiding a question, he began to say, in the situation in which I find myself, unless with his British accent, of course, a situation in which I find myself, in other words, basically saying that, he's too busy. And the Rebbe interrupted him, which was uncharacteristic of the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, a Jew never finds himself in a situation. A Jew puts himself in a situation. And this is actually encapsulates this entire subject. That you put yourself in this situation, you put yourself in that situation. You decide whether to see this reality, you decide whether to see that reality. It's our choice to be lost in the physical reality. It's our choice to discover the godly reality and to be optimistic. That is simply our choice. When we recognize, how do we know if we are healthy optimists? We are not delusional optimists, as many natural optimists are. How do we know if we're healthy optimists? This is the way you know. The way you know is if, when you recognize a problem, you remind yourself that it is the shell, the peel over the fruit, and that you begin to look for the good that is within it. And that makes you a proactive person. I want to give you one quick example of this. The Rebbe was not a delusional person that just said everything is great. After the Six-Day War, Israel created a defense line along in the Sinai Desert, along the Egyptian border, called the Bar Lev Line. Anyone ever hear of that? Okay. The Bar Lev Line was basically 3 lines of defense. They created 3 lines of them, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and they figured they break through one, the second and third will. The Rebbe happened to have been gifted as a genius, and so he was very well versed in almost every area of life, whether it was science, medicine, or war. And generals used to come to him and speak to him. Almost every Israeli general had meetings with the Rebbe. And when one gentleman came to speak to him, he repeats this, the gentleman that did this, he repeats and recounts this entire meeting. He said that the Rebbe asked him about the Bar Lev line, which very few people actually knew about at that time. And the Rebbe told him that he believes that they're making a grave mistake. They should be putting everyone on one line of defense. Because if you have 3 weaker lines of defense, the Egyptians will end up breaking through all 3. 1973 Yom Kippur War, that's exactly what happened. And that's how Egypt got so far into Sinai, because they broke through all 3 lines of defense. But the point is, and that's not my point. My point is that the Rebbe was a very practical person. In other words, he wasn't delusional. He believed this is what we need to do. Don't say, well, everything is going to be great because God is good. He said, God is good, and we have to do what we need to do to reveal that goodness. We can't live in a world of fantasy. And that's how we know when our optimism is a healthy optimism, when we are not delusional, but we still focus on the good. So we don't become fantasy people who are just saying it's all good. We're saying there is a godly dimension here, and what do I have to do in order to reveal that godly dimension?
Mrs. Hannah Sharfstein moved to Crown Heights in 1954. In 1972, she was completing her master's degree in education.
In the spring of 1972, I completed my second master's degree in Brooklyn College. One of my final courses was in urban sociology, and I had to write a term paper. I decided to write a paper about minority groups, about the challenges being in a large society while maintaining one's traditions, values, heritage, language, religion, and maintaining a uniqueness in this large urban setting. I chose to write about the Chabad community in Crown Heights because that's the community I was most familiar with, obviously. Just about that time, I was having Yechidus with the Rebbe, and I decided to take my term paper with me. I thought he would be interested because he had always displayed a great interest in my writing. I came in, I had my Yechidus with him, and then I told him I just completed my second degree, and I showed him the term paper. And he said he'd like to see it. And I said, surely. I was very excited he wanted to see it. So what he did was he turned a couple of pages, and his first remark was, "Wo sind the footnotes?" Customarily, footnotes, as the word implies, are put at the bottom of the page. But at this stage, they had just put in something new, and the footnotes became a bibliography, which was in the back of the term paper. So the Rebbe looked in the back, and he saw my list of the bibliography, and it's in alphabetical order, and he said, okay. After the Rebbe had seen that, he just held the paper a few minutes and asked me if he could keep it and look through it more carefully, and I was very excited. I mean, I'd gotten an A on the paper, so yes, sure, I wanted to share it. And then a couple of days later, I got the paper back with no less but 2 pages of corrections because the Rebbe corrected it quite differently from my professor. I like this one very much. I wrote, there is a strain of sadness in the music, as I was describing the music, reminiscent of the hard life of a chassid. And just listen to this correction. He encircled the part, the hard life of a chassid, and he wrote in English, the hardship of life. Now that's a tremendous, tremendous difference. You could say it's a small variation, but it makes you think differently. When you say a hard life, it means a depressing life. It means a life that makes you feel that there's no hope. It makes you sad just thinking about it. When you say hardships of life, hardships are obstacles that you can overcome. It's just a totally different way of looking at it. And this is what the Rebbe did with my corrections all the time, just to deepen our understanding and think more about it.
So the point is, when we see things from the perspective of God being in everything, we don't define our life as a hard life, because life is good. We say, I have hardships in life, but it's not a hard life. So with this, we conclude lesson number 1. Thanks for joining. If you didn't sign up yet and you would like to, we'd love to have you sign up.